Thank you, Anita. Thank you for all you do to make these virtual church services possible. I've noticed I see the same team week by week. And you don't know how much I appreciate your dedication. And Stanley, that song, that was outstanding. To be honest, I hadn't heard that song before. Shame on me, right? But that was excellent. That was powerful, and it fit so perfectly with what I want to talk about today, and that is the sure word of prophecy. The sure word of prophecy we just had read to us. The scripture reading for today, and I want to highlight certain things within this, because prophecy is sure, and I want to talk about why today. How we can have confidence that Jesus is coming again. You see, prophecy centers around the coming of Christ. In the Old Testament, prophecy centered around the first coming of Christ, and now prophecy centers around the second coming of Christ. Everything else moving in that direction are merely benchmarks to help us realize where we are in relationship to the coming of Christ. So we read in 2 Peter Chapter 1, verse 16, we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Verse 18, we ourselves heard this utterance made from the heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. So Peter is saying we are eyewitnesses of something dramatic in history. We were there. We can testify. We were eyewitnesses. There are very few things more convincing than an eyewitness. And if you ever have to go to court, it's good to have an eyewitness to what you're saying. And beyond that, it's good to have a true eyewitness, because the Bible talks about a false witness. God hates a false witness. Jesus said, I am the true witness. We can depend on Jesus. Years ago in England, Plymouth, England, well, actually, the story starts even before that. There was a little village a few miles from Plymouth, England. And in a bar one night, there was a fight that broke out. And there was a big guy that was always picking fights, and he was beating up on a little guy and got the best of him, of course, and everyone was watching, and the little guy shook his fist and he said, someday I'm going to kill you. He was really angry, and he stormed out. Nobody liked the big bully. Well, sometime later, I don't know how much later, in Plymouth, England, there was a man by the name of Captain Jarvis. And Captain Jarvis was there on a business trip, and he was sleeping in a hotel, and he couldn't sleep that night. And he turned and tossed for some reason. He finally got up, and it was around midnight, a little before midnight, put his clothes on, went and walked the streets. And just tried to get tired again. And he looked at his watch, and it was just about midnight. He knew that there in Plymouth, at the courthouse, there was a huge bell that chimed on every hour. He'd never heard that bell chime 12 times. So I thought, well, I'm going to stand here. I want to feel the vibrations of this powerful bell. And sure enough, the bell began to toll right at 12 o'clock. 1, 2, 3, and so on. Number 12, and it tolled one more time. 13 times it rang. He thought, well, I've never heard of such a thing. Did I count wrong? What's the problem? And he noticed that there was another man standing over near the tower. And he thought, well, I'm going to ask him because maybe he was counting too. So he went over to the man and he said, did you just hear what I heard? And the man said, well, I don't know what you heard, but I think I heard 13 times that the bell tolled. And he said, well, I thought I was losing my mind, but I think I heard the same thing. And so they had some small talk and went their own ways. Some time later, Captain Jarvis was asleep at home. And he awakened and he couldn't go back to sleep, and he had a very strong impression, put your clothes on and go out. And he thought, well, that doesn't make any sense, but he couldn't get rid of it. I don't know if you've ever had a strong impression and the Lord is trying to urge you to do something, but it doesn't go away. It gets stronger and stronger. So Captain Jarvis, finally, he couldn't fight it off, no matter how he rationalized this doesn't make sense. He finally got up, put his clothes on, went down to the front door, opened the door, and there was his worker, servant, whatever he was, with his horse saddled for him. And it was dark. And this never happens this early in the morning. And so he thought, wow, this is strange. He asked him, he said, why are you out here with my horse saddled? He said, well, I was trying to sleep and I had this strong impression, go get the captain's horse, saddle it and bring it, he will need it. And I couldn't get rid of that impression, so finally I got the horse and I saddled it and I brought it and you opened the door and I just got here. And so Captain Jarvis thought, well, this is really strange. I'm going to get on my horse and I don't know where I'm going. I think I'll let the horse lead the way. So sure enough, the horse led the way through town and went down the hill to the river. And he thought, well, this is strange because this time in the morning it's still dark. The ferryman isn't even there. The ferry isn't operating until later when the sun is up. But lo and behold, he came down to the bank, and there was the ferry with the ramp down and the ferryman standing there. And he said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I had this really strong impression in the night, and it wouldn't leave me, and I was supposed to go and get the ferry ready and put the ramp down because someone was going to need it early in the morning. So here I am. He said, well, I'm the one that needs it. So he and his horse got on the ferry that went across the other side. Again, he let his horse lead the way, went through the countryside several miles, and by then the sun had come up, came to a village, and by then people were out and about, and so he didn't know why he was there, but that's where the horse had brought him. So he asked someone, he said, is there anything special going on in town today? And the person said, well, not really. It's pretty well an ordinary day, although there is a trial down at the courthouse. And he said, I don't know much about it, but I know there's a trial and a lot of people are talking about it and so on and so forth. So Captain Jarvis rode his horse to the courthouse. And he went in and the court was in session. And a man was on trial. And he recognized the man. And the man, the judge was reminding the man that witnesses had heard him say, I will kill you. And the man had been killed, the big bully. And he said, and what do you have to say? And the man said, well, I did say that. I was angry. He'd beat up on me and so on and so forth. And I was really angry. I said, I'm going to kill you, but I did not kill this man. I don't kill people. I'm not a murderer. I did. And the judge says, well, what is your alibi? He said, I don't know what to say. He said, I wasn't even in the village that night. I was over at Plymouth that night. And the reason I remembered it was because I was standing out on the street and the clock at midnight struck 13 times and the courtroom burst out in laughter and thought, this guy is crazy. And the judge said, now you want me to seriously believe that you were not even here on the night of the murder and that you were way over in Plymouth on the night of the murder? And not only that, you want this court to believe that you heard the bell toll 13 times. He said, that's stretching things a little far. And then a man in the back, Captain Jarvis, stood up. And he said, may I be sworn in as a witness? And of course, you can imagine the rest of the story. He testified, yes, the clock struck 13 times. And I had conversation with this man, and I said, did you hear what I heard? And so on and so forth. The man was acquitted, and he was released, and he was not guilty. Because of a witness, the power of a witness, a true witness. But notice what Peter says here. He says in verse 19, and so we have, that is my version, and maybe I've mentioned this before in my sermons. In the Greek, the word translated "and" is kai. "And" is a connector, or a conjunction, but it also means "but." It can show connection or contrast, and it all depends on the context. And often in the Bible, when you see the word "and" and you're reading and you think, I think a "but" should really be here and not an "and," and this is one of those cases. He says, but we have the prophetic word made more sure. More sure than what? He just said, we were eyewitnesses. We were there. We can tell you what we saw, but we have something more sure than what we saw, and that is the word of prophecy. It's more sure than what eyewitnesses saw. Well, you say, how can that be? Well, why do you believe your Bible? The eyewitnesses, I've never met one of them. I've never met Peter or John or Mark. Luke is not a first-hand eyewitness, but he talked to eyewitnesses. I've never met them. How do we know the Bible is true? How do we know that these witnesses didn't get together and say, well, let's write this story out. We'll change a few facts so that people will not think that we got together. How do we know that? How do we know that the Bible is true? He's saying that there's something more sure than eyewitnesses. Matthew, Mark, John, eyewitnesses firsthand of Jesus. Hebrews 12, verse 1. Hebrews 12, verse 1 is a summary of Hebrews, the 11th chapter. And of course, Hebrews, the 11th chapter, we know is a chapter or a hall of faith. So it gives many names. It talks about Abel, and it talks about Enoch, and it talks about Abraham and Noah and Sarah and Isaac and Gideon and Moses and Rahab and all these people of faith. And then to summarize it, and the chapter should not be cut off at verse 40, but in chapter 12, verse 1, it says, therefore, whenever you see the word therefore, see what is therefore. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. In other words, the hall of faith is a cloud of witnesses. We have these people witnessing to us. Let us lay aside every encumbrance and so on and so forth. We have many witnesses, and they're in the Bible. But the question is, we haven't met them. How do we know that the Bible is true? Well, that's a good question, and I'm glad that you ask. We have something more sure, and that's the word of prophecy. I like something sure. I don't know about you. We built a 2-story house. I don't know why we did that. I guess it's because I don't like laying block, and I figured that rather than have a big foundation with a 1-story house, I'd make a small foundation and go up, see. So we did. And we have a 12 pitch roof. And like I said 2 weeks ago, building a new chimney, but we had a chimney going through the roof, and at times I needed to get up there with a chimney sweep, brush, and clean the chimney. And that's way up in the air. So we have a 24-foot extension ladder. And when I climb that ladder, I like to make sure that it's sure, see. I dig it in. I make sure that the feet can't slip out. I've actually put blocks behind it. Even though it's at an angle, it's not going to slip anyway. Then when I get up to the top, before I go out on the roof, I tie a rope around the base of the chimney and tie it around the ladder so I can't kick the ladder out, because I would have a nightmare of being up there without a ladder, see. And I've never fallen. I like something sure, something solid. So Webster says that the word sure means safe, firmly established, steadfast, reliable, trustworthy, assured, confident, certain, admitting no doubt, bound to happen when we think of the future, inevitable, sure. The Mustang transmission went out, automatic transmission, so I had to take it out, take it apart. It's still on the bench because I haven't had time to put it together. And when I work under a car, I want to make sure the car's not going to come down. I want it to be sure, see. So 4 concrete blocks, 1 under each wheel. But that isn't sure enough because the car could roll off. And so I have these little boards with little smaller boards on the end of them sticking up, and I put that board on top of the concrete block, and then the wheel is held and can't roll. A concrete block can crack. You want a board on top of it. You want to be sure when you're under the weight of a car. I like things sure. Hebrews, the 6th chapter. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 and onward, it says, "For when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you, I will surely multiply you. And thus, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation in the end of to end every dispute. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, in order that by 2 unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we may have strong encouragement." That's an interesting verse. God made an oath. It says 2 unchangeable things. One is God, and the second thing, he cannot lie. So he swore by himself. 2 things. Genesis 41 and 30, verse 32 says this. And you remember the story of Joseph, who was dragged out of prison before Pharaoh. Pharaoh had had a dream. And he wondered what the dream meant. And nobody could interpret it. And so Joseph was brought because he had interpreted dreams. The dream was that there were 7 cattle. There were lean cattle and fat cattle, and the lean cattle ate the fat cattle, and they were still lean and so on. And then there were 7 ears of corn, 7 skinny ears of corn, 7 fat ears of corn, and there was one meaning to both dreams. But notice what the Bible says. This is what Joseph said in interpreting it by the power of God. Verse 32 of Genesis 41. "Now as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about." In the Bible, 2 is emphasis. It means this is sure. You've been given 2 dreams that mean the same thing. It is sure. In fact, years before that, when Joseph was still home, he had 2 dreams. One dream was the sheaves bowed over to him. There were 11 of them. And he interpreted that, or tried to understand it. That meant his brothers would bow to him, and of course they did someday. Then he had a dream that the sun, moon, 11 stars bowed or gathered around him. They were 2 dreams with the same meaning. And the fact that there were 2 meant that it was sure. Let's turn to Revelation, the 12th chapter, verses 6 and 14. Revelation chapter 12, verses 6 and 14. Revelation 12 is a unique chapter in history. I've talked about it many times, sometimes in this pulpit, more in seminars. And Revelation 12 is the heart and center of the book of Revelation. It is an artist's brushstroke of salvation history, highlighting 6 events. But notice one of those events says in verse 6, and the woman, and these are symbols, the woman representing God's people and God's truth, the whole package of God's program, what he's doing for us, his truth that he's trying to bring to the world, and his people that adhere to that truth. The woman, as opposed to the harlot. The woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that there she might be nourished for 1,260 days. We learned that a day in symbolism and prophecy often represents a year, so 1,260 years. Now notice verse 14. 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman in order that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time. I should have brought a chart, because when you break that down, a time, 360 days, as they took a year in those days, and times, or 2 times 360, would be 720, and dividing a time, 180, you add those up, and you have 1,260 days, or 1,260 years. It's interesting that this is mentioned twice in this one passage. Actually, it's mentioned 7 times in the Bible, but it's twice in this passage. Why is that? Because God is pointing out something that he wants us unmistakably to note, that it is sure. Here's a period of time that will happen, that when it's over, we can look back on it and say that surely happened. The sure word of prophecy. Now, back to witnesses. The Bible is testimony by many people, many authors, saying what they experienced, what they saw. And some people don't believe the Bible. They say, well, the Bible could have been written by anybody and da-da-da-da. And we believe we know better. But you know, the Bible has credentials. Did you know that? The Bible has credentials. Credentials are something that prove who you are. So as a minister, if I'm going to go into a prison to visit someone, they want to see my credentials. Is this guy really who he says he is? Is he really a minister or a pastor, or is he in here to sneak something into a prisoner? And so they ask for those. Rarely do I have to show credentials as a minister, but that's one place where you do. If you're traveling abroad, you have to show your passport. That is your credential. They look at the passport, they look at your face, they say, yeah, this is the person. And he's legit or she's legit. You can come in. Sometimes you have to show your driver's license or some other form of picture ID. It's credentials. The Bible has proof or credentials that it is sure. And those credentials are the book of Daniel and Revelation. Now, how do we know that? Because we can prove when they were written by various things. Some people have dug into this, because some people say, well, they're written after the fact and so on. No. The book of Daniel was written 600 years before the time of Christ, or nearly 600 years. And it talked about history that was coming, that hadn't happened yet. And today we can look back on those prophecies and we can check them off and say, wow, before they ever happened, God knew exactly what was going to happen. And you can compare it to history and you can see the Bible is true. So that's why Peter said, we were eyewitnesses. We saw all this. We're telling you this. But I know you could say, well, how do I believe you, Peter? But we have something more sure, and that is the word of prophecy. The Bible, Daniel and Revelation, and there are some other prophecies that are what we call classical prophecies. They give credentials or verification to the Bible. So let's just think a little bit about those things. In Daniel 2 and in Daniel 7, you have visions. Daniel 2, you have a vision of an image. And the head of the image was gold. And then next came silver, and then bronze and iron, and down in the feet, mixture of iron and clay. And the interpretation was given that you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. Your kingdom is the gold. And after you will come another kingdom. And sure enough, it happened. You know, Nebuchadnezzar thought a lot about that dream, and he said, I don't want this to happen. So he had this huge image, just like the one in his dream, made out of all gold. Had everyone bow down to it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down, not merely because the second commandment said, thou shalt not bow down, but they did not want to give credence to false prophecy. God had said, after you will come another. And so we have the fantastic story of Cyrus, which is kind of long, and I won't recount it all here, but he came to power in Persia when the Medes actually controlled Persia. And he was able to conquer Babylon partly because he was a historian. He knew a little history of Babylon. Nitocris was a queen of Babylon, and she had done some excavating and building, and she had built a canal into a stone quarry where her armies had taken out stones to build bridges across the river, Euphrates River in Babylon from one side to the next. And so this was years before. And so Cyrus thought, if I just dry up the waters by remaking the ditch to the stone quarry and let the water go that way, it'll go down in the riverbed. I'll sneak a troop under the wall. They'll go in, and hopefully the inner gates will be open. And sure enough, they were, as the Bible had said. The Bible named Cyrus 150 years before it happened. It said the gates will not be shut, and you will send my people home. And so the Bible is sure. It says that after Persia, there would be another kingdom. Alexander the Great began the kingdom of Greece. And by the way, Greece was not even a country before Alexander the Great. His father was king of Macedon, Philip the Great. And he had a fresh memory of one of the Dariuses, one of the Medes, one of the kings of the Medes, or the Persians, coming across the isthmus from Turkey into Greece, today Turkey, and bringing this huge army and just devastating many of the cities of Greece. And he was so angry, that as Philip was, that he had a vision of getting the armies of Greece together. All these little city-states that were always fighting each other. If only he could get them in unity, he could take them over and teach those Persians a lesson. And his son, Alexander, would hear his dad dreaming and talking about this. And one day there was a parade, a celebration of some event, I don't remember what, and because I wasn't really there. But Philip, in the parade and a little bit drunk, he was so excited by the crowds, he started to say, I am a god. I am a god. He kept repeating that. And do you know, that night he was struck down dead. And Philip, his son, came to power. He was 20 or 21, I believe. Suddenly, he was king of Macedon. And within a year, he had united Greece in such a way that he had an army of 40,000 men. He marched. He went into Persia. And he met the Persian army. The Persian army had 30 times more men in their army than he had in his. They had 1.2 million men. He had 40,000. But guess what the Bible said? And prophecy is sure. And so he went up against that, and the women came out to watch this, little game. The queen was there, the king's mother was there in their chariots, and they watched it all, and they watched their army being routed. The king running for his life into the mountains with his band around him. They saw it all. And Alexander captured the queen and the mother and so on, but when he finally captured the king, they had a big reunion, and he conquered Persia. Why? Because the Bible says it's more sure. We have a sure word of prophecy. Rome came next. And so on and so forth. And the Bible said in the book of Daniel, it said that there would be 10 horns that came out of Rome, 10 divisions. In the early church, that is, in Christianity, in the first 3 centuries, we have the writings of what we call early church fathers. They're not in the Bible. People like Polycarp and Irenaeus and so on and so forth. And they had things to say, and some of them talked about prophecy and the coming of Christ, and they said that Rome, which exists today, is going to be conquered and divided into 10 groups or 10 nations. It hadn't happened yet. How did they know? Sure word of Bible prophecy. And sure enough, it happened. And then it said a little horn would come up and pluck up 3 by the roots. And sure enough, in the 500s, the Emperor Justinian made the Pope the head of all the churches in the West. 533, he made that edict. In the same year, he went after 3 tribes. Those 3 tribes had problems. They were not Orthodox. They were Arian. They didn't believe Jesus was everlasting, but he became God from being a human. And so we couldn't tolerate that, didn't have religious freedom, and so they destroyed the Vandals. 533. 534, they destroyed the Heruli. And by 554, they had destroyed the Ostrogoths. 533, and you run ahead 1,260 years. It brings you to the French Revolution, when the French Assembly waved a fist at God and said, you don't exist, religion is banned, and everyone must recant religion. The Bibles must be burned, the catechisms must be burned, and that happened exactly 1,260 years from the time the Pope was made head of all the churches. France had been the strongest supporter of the papacy. Now they totally turned against them, the sure word of prophecy. In Revelation, the 11th chapter, we see that it says the 2 witnesses, the Old and New Testament, would lie dead in the street of the great city, which is mystically called Sodom and Egypt, which Paris was, symbolically called Sodom because of its licentiousness, and Egypt because of its high-handed rebellion. And the bodies of the Old and New Testament, the 2 witnesses, would lie as though they're dead for 3.5 years. And sure enough, the French Assembly, 3 years after they banned Christianity and banned the Bible and actually began to annihilate Christians, 3 years later, they said, we've gone too far. Our country's in chaos and anarchy. So they rescinded the decree. It was implemented 6 months later, which makes it exactly 3.5 years. The sure word of prophecy. Well, as that period closed, according to Jesus in Matthew, the 24th chapter, Matthew chapter 24, and Jesus said, immediately, this is verse 29, Matthew 24:29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now this is what we call classical prophecy. Daniel, Revelation are apocalyptic. They use symbols. Here Jesus is talking about more literal language. He's not talking about periods of time. He's talking about events. So when it says immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's talking about the dark ages, when his followers would be persecuted for many, many years. He said immediately after, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. Immediately after. Well, the interesting thing is, it was in 1780, I believe it was May 19, 1780, that we have the dark day, and when the moon came up, it was like blood. And you've heard the history of that. Say, wait a minute. The 1260 years did not come to an end until 1790s, and this is 1780. Jesus said immediately after. No, Jesus said immediately after the tribulation, the troubles of those days. Do you know that the troubles began to wane before the time was up? And in Europe, Joseph II king of the Holy Roman Empire, they called it, king of Austria. Austria was the strongest power in the middle of Europe and influenced all of Europe. In 1781, he made the Edict of Toleration, putting an end to the persecution by Catholics against Protestants and Jews. And 1 year before, actually less than a year before, when you look at the dates, God had allowed the dark day to happen where the spotlight of prophecy was, and that is America, to wake people up to what was going on. Then Jesus said, the stars of the sky will fall from heaven. Well, that happened in 1833, again here in America, which was the spotlight of history at the time, because it says the earth helped the woman after the 1260 years. So here we have America, and the stars fell from Mexico to Canada, way out into the Atlantic and far to the west as people were to see it. Say, well, why did it wait till 1833? Well, the interesting thing is the Spanish Inquisition was the worst part of the persecution of the Dark Ages. And it went on for a few centuries. It was started by Isabella I, Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones that sent Columbus to America. Spanish Inquisition, millions of people lost their lives. They put many Incas to death, many people that would not recant their views. In South America, where it was real intense, I've been there and I've seen the places where they were martyred. And that officially came to an end in 1834, and 1 year before that happened, God showered the stars to show the end of the tribulation. And the person that brought it to an end was Isabella II by a decree. It had already tapered down, and she made it official. The Inquisition is over. There are reasons why God does what he does. I hear people today saying, well, you know, the sun, moon, stars, those signs and so on, they were a long time ago. People don't know about them, so God will surely do it again. That's because we make a mistaken belief that they're signs of the coming of Christ. Jesus said they are signs that the tribulation is over and we're entering a new era. You see, the French Revolution and the founding of America were watersheds in history. We went from the past empires to a new era where people were more free and the gospel could go to the whole world. It was a whole new era. In the Bible, it has transpired just as Jesus said. I'm trying to look here and see what I can cut out of my sermon here, because I realize that I can get carried away and talk too much. But you know, another thing Jesus said in that same chapter concerning the temple, he said, not one stone will be left on another. And in the year 380 something, an emperor by the name of Julian came to the throne. And he'd been raised a Christian, quote unquote, by Constantius and by Constantine. And he came to the throne when Constantius died. And as soon as he came to the throne, he said, I'm not a Christian, I'm a pagan. I want to restore Rome to its pagan, glorious past. Christianity, his uncle Constantius had killed all of the rivals to the throne. And he thought, well, if this is Christianity, I don't want it. We're going back to the virtue of pagan Rome. And so one thing he wanted to do is prove that Christian prophecy was false. So he gave an edict that the temple be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Did you know that? It was in the 380s. And he put this guy Alypius in charge of the project. And so Alypius called for Jews. Jews had been forbidden to go in Jerusalem or even in Judea. So many had migrated to Egypt, Alexandria. And so he called for the Jews to come back and let's rebuild the temple. So they started to dig for the foundation. And guess what? There was a great earthquake, in fact, more than one. Plus, fire and steam started to come up from the earth. I don't know if you've ever been to Yellowstone National Park, but stuff comes up out of the earth. And that's exactly what happened on Temple Mount when Julian tried to rebuild the temple. And it scared people to death, and they scattered, and the temple was never rebuilt. What did Jesus say? Not one stone will be left on another. What are you getting to, Pastor? Well, I'm almost there. For 300 years plus, Protestants believed what I'm telling you here today. In other words, they took Daniel 7 seriously. They knew that the papal reign was the Dark Ages, and it began in these certain years and it ended in these certain years. They knew that. They taught it for 300 years. But then something happened. The devil wanted to make sure, wanted to confuse people. So in 1830, there were three people: Edward Irving in London, John Darby in England, and Margaret MacDonald up in Scotland. And in the same year, all of them received unique perceptions. Margaret MacDonald received visions, not Bible study, visions. Edward Irving had a church where they were beginning to speak in tongues and have prophecies as they spoke in tongues. And they were receiving the word that the 1260 years was not past. Those were literal days in the future. We call it futurism today. And they bought into it. They drank the Kool-Aid. Futurism actually came from the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church. In 1585, Francisco Ribera wrote a 550-page book or volume interpreting Revelation to take the heat off the Pope. And to do that, he said the Pope isn't the fulfillment of the 1260-year prophecy. Actually, that's a literal period of days just before Jesus returns to earth. That was the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Today, all Protestants except Seventh-day Adventists believe that. They have drunk the Kool-Aid. And the Lord, through prophecy, Jesus said in Matthew 25, beware when? In the last days of false prophets, false prophecy. For he says they will deceive many. I've talked to a professor. I was riding along with other ministers, various denominations, and one of them was a Bible teacher at a Bible college. And the driver said, this is Dennis Pumford. He's written a book on Revelation and so on. And this Bible teacher pricked up his ears. Oh, that's interesting. It says, are you pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib? See, that's an assumption that everyone's future. Everyone's believes in futurism. I said, I'm none of the above. And I began to tell him about the 1260 years of the Dark Ages. He had never heard of it. He was a Bible teacher at a Bible college. Never heard of it. Futurism has roots so deep today that people have forgotten the sure word, and everyone's afloat. And you hear many theories. Well, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. Israel is about ready to do this, that, or another thing. And you hear all these things because people are adrift. And you know how it happened? And I will close with this thought. In 1844, the church, the Seventh-day Adventist church, had not come about. They were expecting Jesus to come soon. They had that right, but they had the date wrong. And they also learned about the Sabbath, a truth that God wanted proclaimed in the last days. And Protestants, looked at this little group and said, well, they were confused on one thing. They must be confused on the Sabbath too. Back in those days, Protestants applied the fourth commandment to Sunday. They didn't work on Sunday. And they kept Sunday holy according to the fourth commandment. And so there happened to be a World's Fair coming in Chicago. And in preparation for that event, Congress was in charge of the World's Fair to a degree. And it was going to last for several months, and obviously it would span Sundays. And so the question is, do we allow the World's Fair to be open on Sunday, the Lord's Day? And so they were having a debate in Congress. Meanwhile, Seventh-day Adventists began to sign petitions and send them to Congress and said, we have a separation of church and state. You cannot legislate something that's only for certain types of Christians, because Sabbath isn't Sunday. And then there were secular people saying you shouldn't be involved in religion, leave the fair open. And there were other, and so on. So this conversation, are you aware that in American history to that point, there had never been so many petitions sent to Congress about any subject until the Sabbath became an issue. The Sabbath was a national debate in 1892 in preparation for 1893 World's Fair. And so the Religious Liberty Department, I don't know who the editor was, he wrote a whole article about the Sabbath and published that. One of the magazines landed on the desk of Cardinal Gibbons in Rome. And he looked at that and he read it and he thought, wow, these Adventists are right. And so he began to write a series of articles that took many weeks in a Catholic periodical, well, I think it came out weekly, talking about how Adventists are the only Protestant church. And Protestants are following the Catholic Church because they keep Sunday. And the Catholic Church changed the day. And this really created discussion. And Protestants had a choice. Either they go back to the Bible and become true Protestants, or they discover passages in the Bible that explain why they keep Sunday that have nothing to do with the Catholic Church, which is what they did. And so they came up with these arguments that we hear today. Well, the law was nailed to the cross, law's done away with, we're under grace now, not under law. All these arguments. Two different dispensations, law of Moses doesn't apply, and all these arguments. These are new arguments because Protestants wanted to cover their bases and not be Catholics. Do you know what Jesus said about this? Well, it's found in John the 12th chapter in verse 35. John 12, verse 35. Jesus said, therefore Jesus said to them, that would be the disciples, for a little while longer the light is among you. Walk while you have the light, that darkness may not overtake you. He who walks in the darkness does not know where he goes. When Protestant churches, by and large, rejected the Sabbath truth, they fell into darkness and easily slipped into other heresies, including futurism. In 1830, futurism tried to make inroads into Protestantism, but it didn't get very far. There were prophetic, gatherings of all the different churches in the 1870s and 1880s, and they still agreed and taught what we teach. But in 1892, they rejected the Sabbath wholesale, and God allowed them to slip into darkness, and within a few short years, they bought into futurism. Pentecostalism began, which began the charismatic movement that spread to other churches in the 1960s, and now is the fastest growing movement. All of these things came because rejection of a clear truth from the Bible. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. We have a sure word of prophecy that people are rejecting today. And you hear so many theories. I have people send me things, listen to this, listen to that. Here's what's going on in Israel. And no, the Bible says in Revelation 13 that the last power on planet Earth is America. And America is going to give up its principles. There's going to be persecution. We will not be able to have the freedoms we have, and we will be forced to worship in certain ways. And that's how this planet ends. Israel is a sideshow. Where does it come from? All these expectations that are sideshow? It comes from rejecting the sure, and there's nothing more sure in prophecy than the repeated 1,260 days. In closing, Pastor, you already said that. Revelation 12:17. I'm closing with this verse. And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. There should be no confusion about this verse. It says the devil's angry in the last day with people who do two things. Number one, obey God, keep his commandments. That includes the Sabbath. And secondly, they hold to the testimony of Jesus. Revelation 1, verse 2 says the testimony of Jesus is all that he gave in the book of Revelation. The interesting thing is when you compare Daniel and Revelation, both of them apocalyptic books, given to Daniel and then to John through an angel, except when it came to the 1,260 years. Then in the book of Daniel, Jesus himself steps in, the man dressed in white linen above the river, raised his hand, swore by him to live forever and ever. There will be a time, times half a time. Revelation chapter 10. The angel steps aside. Jesus steps in and said, swears by him, lives forever and ever, that time will be no longer, or delay will be no longer, meaning the 1,260 days are over. The testimony of Jesus, the heart of it is the 1,260-year prophecy, because Jesus knew that when you abandon that, you're afloat in speculation. And that's where Christians are today. And those who believe in all of God's commandments and hang on to the historicist view of prophecy that Protestants used to believe, they are hanging on to the sure word, and it makes the devil angry. Jesus is coming soon. And we need to continue and not be deceived. I know it's easy to turn on the radio or the television and hear this other stuff. Some of it's very convincing. But we have a sure word of Bible prophecy.